Welcome to the second part of the Dvoretsky's endgame manual series. In this part we're going to be discussing the following themes: king versus pawn endgames and queen versus pawn endgames. Let's begin with the concept of the rule of the square. So what is the rule of the square? To sum it up, if you draw a square with your pawn and the opponent's king is not inside of the square on its turn, you can promote to a queen. So if we look at this example, if it's black to play, black can move to the g6 pawn or play g4, in which case the king has entered our square and we cannot promote to a queen. On the other hand, if we have the turn, we can push our b pawn to b4 and promote to a queen, which wins us the game. So in this case, we can create an obstacle in the path of the king. It sometimes happens that even though the king is located within the square, it still cannot stop the passed pawn. Looking at this example, because its own pawn gets in the way. So looking at this example, we can draw an arrow or a square from our a2 pawn, and we see that the opponent's king is within the square. So the king should be able to catch up to our pawn, so we should not be able to promote. But in this case, if we push our d4 pawn to d5, black has to take on d5, because otherwise our pawn would just promote to da, to queen. In this case, we can just push our pawn to a4 and we can promote to a queen. As we can see, we cannot play king d5, which means we are able to promote to a queen. Another example is the following. If we play king h3, this waiting move places black in zugzwang. Now he loses without the pawn at c7. An analogous zugzwang occurs if you move the pawn at a5 to c5. The difference is that at this time, without the pawn at c7, the position would be drawn. Let's look at Reti's idea. It sometimes happens that the king outside a square of a passed pawn can still catch it. The win of the missing tempo, or even several tempi, is accomplished by the creation of accompanying threads, most often, though not exclusively, with supporting one's own passed pawn. The king's advance is dual purpose. He chases after the h-pawn while simultaneously approaching the queen's wing. So while chasing the h-pawn on h5, our king can also choose to defend our c6 pawn. So the best move would be king g7, after which it goes as follows: h4, king f6, and king b6. So the best move here is to play king e5 to defend the c6 pawn while simultaneously chasing the h4 pawn. So after this, the opponent king would take on c6, and we can play f4 and reach the promoting pawn in time. And now a slightly different version of the idea. If king c8, king c6, king b8, king b5. Again, we defend our promoting pawn while also chasing the opponent's promoting pawn on h7. So the idea is the same. We go to our a5 pawn by playing king c8, king c6, king b8, and king b5. So in this case, b7. Thanks to the threat on a6, white wins a tempo and gets into the square of the h-pawn. So why not king c7? Well, after h5 we can no longer defend our a5 pawn. If we would play a6, which means the opponent can play h5 without worrying about a pawn promotion by us playing a6. So after king takes a5, we would play, of course, c6. So in this sequence, we of course would be within the square, which means we can reach the promoting pawn in time. So what is a floating square? There are cases in which the king must do battle with two separated passed pawns. In these cases, a useful rule is the floating square rule. So if a square whose two corners are occupied by pawns reaches the edge of the board, then one of those pawns must queen. If the square does not reach the edge of the board, then the king can hold the pawns. There are two different files between the pawns, the king can capture both. If the distance is any greater, he can only prevent their further advance. So what does this mean? Let's look at the following position. The squares have reached the edge of the board, which means the pawns can promote to a queen, regardless of whose turn it is. So in this case, the sequence would be as follows: a4, king b4, e4, king takes a4, and we play e3. Again, the pawn on e3 creates a square in which the king on a4 is not contained, so we should be able to promote. Let's shift the pawns to a6 and e6. The squares now reach only the second rank, and the position becomes drawn. So let's play out the sequence. What if we play a5? This would be bad because then king goes to b5. We would play e5. King takes on a5. So if we play e5 to e4, white's king would play b4. So in this case, white's king has enough time to catch up to the pawn on e5. So in this case, black must play f6. After which white plays king c6, king g7, and king c5. What's also possible is e5, king d5, a5, king takes g7, king takes on e5, and in this case we would catch up to the pawn on h5, we would take the pawn on h5, and white's king just goes to d4 and captures our pawn, which also leads to a draw. So here we have another floating square example. The square does not reach the edge of the board and the distance between the pawns is most unfavorable. Two files. This means the pawns are lost regardless of whose turn it is. Let's play out the sequence. King goes to a4, d4, king b3. So the idea behind king b3 is pretty evident. We want to take the pawn on d4, after which we capture the pawn on a5. So king h6, king c4, a4, and king takes on d4. In this case, white wins. What about this example? We have three connected pawns. It is difficult for the king to fight three connected pawns. There's no choice at all if the enemy has any moves in reserve. If not, then a situation of reciprocal zugzwang could arise. White to move wins by playing king b1, after which after which b3 is played. If a3 would be played, then we can play king a2, c3, king goes to b3, and in this case white wins. Get queen versus pawn endgames. So the queen generally wins against either a center or a knight pawn. The algorithm is simple. The queen uses either checks or attacks on the pawn to get closer to the enemy king and drive it into a d1 square. This gives white's king a tempo to get closer to a pawn. This procedure is repeated as often as necessary. So what is the idea here? We just check the king or threaten to take the pawn on d2 until black's king moves to d1. If black's king moves to d1, we will play king to c7. So after multiple checks and threats to take the d2 pawn with our queen, we can move our king closer to the d2 pawn, and if we keep this up we can take the d2 pawn. So what does the sequence look like? We play king g7, after which king b1 is played. Now we play king b6, king c2, queen c5, king b1, queen b4, king c2, queen c4, king b2, queen d3, king c1, queen c3, check. After king d1, and in this case we would move our king to c7 or d7, as long as the king moves closer to the pawn on d2. So king c7 in our case. Let's play that. Then black has no other option to play king e2 or king e1. So now king e2, queen c2, king e1, queen e4 check, king f2, queen d3, king e1, queen e3 check, king d1, and again we will play king c6. So if we repeat this process, we can eventually reach the pawn on d2 and win the game. With a rook or bishop pawn, the above described winning method does not work. Let's look at the following case: a stalemate defensive pairs. So the best move would be to play queen before check, after which king a2, queen c3, king b1, queen b3 check, king a1. Now here we have to play queen e3. If we take on the c2 pawn, we will get a stalemate. So the best move here is queen e3, after which black will play king b1, queen d3, we play king d3 and king b2, queen e2, king a1. A mistake that can occur is on move 6. So on move 6 it is important for black to play king a1, because if king b1 is played, then we can have a winning move, which is king c4. What happens if black plays king b1? Well, then white has king c4. And if in this case black is forced to promote, any other move for black would be losing. So king c1 promotes to a queen, and white has the winning move, king b3. Another example, this win is possible only if the king stands so close that it can help white's queen mate the enemy king. Now, in order to reach the stalemate haven, it will have to cross the c1 square, giving the tempo he needs to win. So if we play king d4 check, they react by playing king e2, and then the sequence goes as follows: queen c3, king d1, queen d3, king c1. Again, the king is in front of the pawn, which allows us to bring our king closer to the pawn. So we play c4. Now black will play king b2, we play king d2, pinning the pawn. Here black plays king b1, and the winning move here would be king b3. So again, if white promotes to a queen on c1, we can just play queen a2, giving us the win. Let's look at a brief example of Zugzwang. The sequence goes as follows: g3, king d7, g4, king e7, and g5. So what if d4 is played? Then the opponent's king goes to d7. We can go capture the pawn on g7. Sequence goes as follows: king d6, king g6, king d5, king takes on g7, king takes on d4. And we are one square ahead of the opponent's pawn on c6. So in this case, both pawns can queen and it would be draw. So back to this position, the optimal move would be king d7. After king d7, we can play f5, king e7, king g6. One decisive move would be to play d4. If black's king goes to f8, we can push our g-pawn, and the king has to either play e7 or e8, and we can take the pawn on g7 and win the game. So let's finally look at the last concept of this video. So what is this? We will threaten to take the opponent's piece while simultaneously avoiding a check from the queen once the opponent's pawn has been promoted. So what does this mean? Let's explain it with an example. In this case, we would want to take the b pawn, so we would first play c3, king a3, king c4, king a4, and now we will play g4. After this, we can expect a check with b5, and now we have to play king d3 instead of c3. The reason for not playing c3 is because we can get checked again if black plays pawn to b4. If black plays pawn to b4 and we're at c3, we have to move our king again, and we just gave away a free move for black. So to avoid this, while still keeping a threat of taking the pawn, we can play king d3. So after king d3, a3, g5, b4, g6, b3, g7, b2, and now we will play king c2. We can expect king a2, but this will lead to a check once we promote our pawn to queen, and this will once again be a winning game for white. This is another example of trying to promote our pawn while avoiding a check from the opponent's pawn. In this case, white is outside the square of the a pawn. His only hope is the Reti idea, so we play king f5, a4, otherwise the king gets into the square. And now king g6, we know that there will be a promotion on a1 regardless of whether we promote or not, so it's best to play g6 instead of f6 ahead of time to avoid this check. So now we play g6. We know that there will be a promotion on a1 eventually, so we might as well move our king out of the way by not playing f6 but g6. After this, a3, e6, a2, e7, king d7 and king f7. This would lead to a draw because both sides can promote. So let's look at this final shouldering example. Quite often one must choose a route for the king that gives shouldering to the enemy king. That is, it prevents the enemy from arriving in time at an important part of the board. White must inevitably win the pawn on a7. Black can save himself only if he can succeed in locking the king into the corner with king c7. So the best move here would be to play king e6, king c3 and king d5. White's king approaches the a7 pawn while simultaneously shouldering the enemy king, keeping it from approaching the c7 square. Okay, so that was the video. Thank you for watching, and if you have questions, please leave a comment. I will be glad to answer them. With that being said, see you in the next video.